Welcome to Listening with China Blue. This is a podcast that focuses on how listening not only informs us about what is occurring in the world around us, but also helps us connect with others, build stronger businesses, strengthens our mental health, and become more creative and compassionate individuals. As more and more people practice attentive listening in a community, it becomes a community building practice that strengthens our mental health as we learn from our neighbors. I will be interviewing people from all walks of life to learn how listening has informed them in their field and helped them to make intelligent decisions. They will be artists, musicians, composers, dancers, business people, psychologists, neuroscientists, and Buddhists, to name a few. About me, I'm an internationally exhibiting sound-based artist. In my work, Discovering Unheard Sounds, I realized that the core component that drove my work was simply listening. That realization put me on the path of speaking about and helping people learn to become better listeners. I began with leading sound walks, which I continue to do in the upstate New York region to help people learn to listen from nature. And now, tune your ears to this podcast to learn about the power of listening. And do pay attention until the end for further information on how to start your own listening practice, share it with others, and to support listening with China Blue. Welcome, Stephan, and thank you for being here. I've known you
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so nice to see your face and hear your voice.
Absolutely, likewise.
I've known you for a while, first through our mutual class in deep listening, where we met. And then following that, through your fascinating Zen Sounds newsletter. And your newsletter captured my attention because of its quirky focus on the fringes of a wide range of music genres. And I'm particularly interested in your process for Zen Sounds because I know in our conversation that we had earlier that you told me that you're not a musician, and you told me that you begin your process. Well, actually, I should say your process starts with a sound that you've heard, and that takes you into an investigation into an artist, and then following that to be able to write about that particular artist. And so I wanted to start there and talk to you about that, your process and the trigger of listening for a sound.
Sure. Yeah. It's hard to really put in words because I can't really make out like what makes me decide that this is a sound that I'm interested in. It's just like I'm listening to music basically all the time. It's something that I've been doing forever. I think it goes back to when I was 7, 8 years old. I started listening to music and I never really stopped. And these days I tend to listen to music, of course, and during listening, I already think maybe this could be something for the newsletter. It could be an interesting topic or an interesting artist to write about. But then I wait for this, this inspiration and sound that you mentioned. And I can't really pinpoint it what it is. It's almost mystical in a way. But
Fascinating.
yeah, it's just something that gets an emotional response from me somehow. And I get interested, and then I do my research, and then the newsletter basically writes itself.
Wow. Well, also, I recall you telling me that your house living in your house from the time you were a child was filled with music, and that having music surrounding you is and was something that you gravitate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Music was always on in my household. My parents, they're from the 60s generation. I wouldn't say like you could say hippies, but they wouldn't like that a lot. They're more like the student protest generation, you know? and
Yeah.
they played a lot of music when I grew up. In our house, they had a vinyl record collection, and I remember as a child sitting on the living room floor and just going through these records and finding like just going for visual cues first and then listening to the music and getting carried away. And so yeah, I think you're right. Listening to music is something that feels like home to me. And because I've moved a lot around in my life and I lived in different cities, and listening to music is always something that I can kind of rely on wherever I am. So yeah, I would absolutely say this is yeah, it transports me into this state that I've been knowing for a very long time.
So that's really fascinating, because that means that you take your home with you wherever you are.
In a way, yes. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what home actually means to me and to other people, because I come from a family of refugees, actually. You know, my great grandpa like my grandparents, they were fleeing from what is now Russia or Poland or Lithuania. Like
Mhm.
the area where they come from is
Right.
basically divided between these three countries. And at the end of the Second World War, they fled from their home, settling in Western Germany. And actually, the place where I live now, which is around 2 hours north of Berlin, near the Baltic Sea, it is kind of on the way, like it's on the route that they took during their journey, um,
Nice.
almost 100 years ago, not maybe 80, 90 years ago. So, yeah, I think the topic of like what's home for you or for me is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And music is something, like you say, I can always have it with me. I don't need like a place, a physical place. It's more of a mind state or something that I can bring with me wherever I am.
I think that's so beautiful, to bring your sense of home with you, and a sense of calmness, and the sense of, I should say, the sense of calmness that music provides for you is sort of speaks a lot to the core of what listening is about, and it's about being calm and attentive and paying attention to the world that surrounds you, to what you hear, and in your case, the kind of music that you're fascinated by, which is, I think, almost everything.
Yeah, if you speak in terms of genre, then definitely yes, I'm interested in everything. But then again, in every genre, there's only a very small amount of artists and records that really speak to me. So
Oh,
it's almost like there's like this hidden canon of music that I'm discovering have been discovering for the last couple of decades. So yeah, it's not many people they're listening to country music or they're listening to hip hop or they're into classical. I don't restrict myself like that. I find interesting music in all genres. And but there's like I said, there's just this particular kind of music in every genre that is special to me and very um I mean, there's so many words that don't really say a lot, but that have been used for describing that, like experimental, alternative, underground. And I don't know what it exactly means, but there's this particular kind of music that is definitely not the mainstream top 40 radio stuff usually.
yeah, yeah.
I like some pop music. It's not like I absolutely despise it or like I'm above it or anything, but I've just always felt drawn to this fringe type of music, like the weird stuff, the outsider art. That's always been speaking to me much more than the mainstream stuff.
And that's what I find so interesting, because actually it seems like without purpose, you're establishing the fringe genre.
Yeah, in a way, it's like people sometimes ask me like, how do I decide what to write about in my newsletter? And like I said, I don't want to restrict myself to a particular genre. I think people that like my writing, and I've been reading that a lot from like in feedback emails and stuff. So people that enjoy what I do, they really like that openness in my newsletter and that open-mindedness towards music from all sorts of genres and backgrounds and traditions and places even. Like I'm not even just looking at the Western canon. I'm very, very interested in music from the global South, from Africa, from Brazil, from Japan. Like I'm
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
very interested in that type of music as well. Because we tend to look at, we as in Americans and Europeans, we tend to look like we have this lens through which we view culture,
Sure.
and we just tend to think this is the most important thing in the world. But there's like so much music out there which is absolutely amazing, which doesn't adhere to these traditions.
Absolutely. You also are active in meditating, in Buddhist meditation and Tai Chi. And more recently, you discovered a deep listening practice that you've added to something that you focus on. And it makes me wonder if this focus has influenced, or is just an evolution of what your focus is in listening for sounds and listening to music.
It's probably an evolution, but in the past, I've viewed these as two separate things. I've like my passion for music goes back to my early childhood. And then around 10, 15 years ago, I started getting interested in Buddhist meditation, mindfulness meditation, insight meditation. And I took up a Zen practice, a Vipassana practice. And I saw this spiritual path that I took up as something pretty much separate from my music passion. But then in a way, I saw that the two things weren't as separate as I thought.
Mm-hmm.
And listening mindfully, mindful listening is actually another word for deep listening, right? So when
Yeah.
I came across Pauline Oliveros and her concept of deep listening and reading a bit more about it, I was super intrigued about it because it brings together these three aspects, right? You have the listening, like the meditation part,
Mm-hmm.
where like just attentive, focused listening. And then you have the performance part where you actually like you get out of your consumer position and you really because that's how
Yeah.
in our culture we just consume music. People say they consume content even. I mean, I don't really like that vocabulary, but you know what I mean. So there's this performance aspect to it as well. People get together and make sounds and listen to the sounds that other people make and react to them. And then the third thing is the dream, the dream part of it, like the dream traveling and all of that. And that's something that I never really looked into either. So I was just very interested in what this could offer me, and I saw that it brought together these strands that were interesting for me in the past, music and mindfulness, basically.
Right. Right. And there's actually a fourth component was the physical element that is incorporated, that was started through a Tai Chi, an interest that evolved into getting folded into the deep listening tradition.
Absolutely. And I wasn't aware of that aspect before I started that deep listening course where we actually met. That
Yeah.
was a really nice aspect of that I met so many interesting and amazing people from all around the world through that deep listening course, including you. So it feels like a community, and like that course, it was so great to see how the instructors managed to create the safe space where we all could be able to open up and be attentive, but at the same time also just let go of expectations that we have of ourselves or our social roles and all that kind of stuff. So um, yeah, I can just say everyone who might be interested in that to look into it.
Yeah, yeah, and talking about the safe space aspect of it is was really important component to it, to the course for me, because I was not certain about what I was stepping into. It's not clear, and yet I thought, well, I knew Pauline, and I have participated in a couple of her workshops, and she's invited me to speak. So I just I know of her practice through those experiences, but stepping into it made me feel very uncertain the first couple of sessions about what are we doing here. But you're right,
Mhm.
it's just letting go.
Yeah, and for me as well, it was similar. I mean, I didn't know Pauline, or I didn't really have a connection to that whole world before, but and I also, like I said, I'm not a musician. I mean, I played some guitar in my youth, and I was the bass player of a band in my high school, but that was never really serious, you know. I didn't take it that seriously. So I never really performed in front of people. I was always in that on that other side. I was
Mhm.
looking at performers, I was judging performers, I was judging performances, recordings, reviewing recordings. That was my world and my job, and also my kind of safe space. So getting out of that comfort zone into a space where I was acting, I was making sounds, I was interacting with other people, it was in a way a whole world opened up for me through that course. It feel like it
Wow.
really feels like that.
Wow, that's so imagine. Excuse me, I'm stumbling over my excitement. Going from the position of being the listener to being the participant is an enormous step. And hearing you describe it makes me realize that not everybody would do that. They're just, it's easier to be the person that sits and listens and being in almost a passive role versus an active role.
Yeah. And it also made me, I think, much more sensitive towards the vulnerability of an artist and a performer.
Yeah,
Because, you know, in the past decades, when I was writing reviews or giving commentary on artists' work, sometimes I think now, retrospectively, some of that stuff might have hurt the artist or the performer's feelings if it wasn't positive. And
sure.
I think in the past I wasn't super aware of that aspect, that in that moment where you stand on stage or you get into a recording studio, um, how vulnerable you make yourself and how hard that is. And if the feedback that comes back isn't the one you would like, that can be heartbreaking, you know?
Oh, yeah.
So
It's,
I
it can,
think from today's point of view, and that's maybe also just me getting older and a bit more mild and wiser, hopefully. I think a lot of the stuff I might have written 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't write it the same way today.
well, yeah, that is wiser.
So in my newsletter, maybe you will have noticed I never write about stuff that I don't like or that I don't enjoy. I just focus on the stuff that I find interesting and that I really want people to check out and listen to, because I think all like that other stuff is just wasted energy for me. Like, why would I
Yeah,
waste energy on putting someone down who has put himself in that vulnerable spot, you know?
sure, sure. And it's a kindness of yours to recognize that that's the way to structure it.
Yeah, and there's so much stuff out there. I mean, of course, there is a place for cultural criticism on the level of like if there is something that really everyone in our society speaks about, let's say a Taylor Swift album, then there is definitely a place for someone stepping in and saying, hey, is this really that good? Or like, is
Sure.
there maybe an aspect to it which is not really as amazing as everyone thinks? But on the level where I'm operating, on like you said, the fringes, like the really like the underground stuff where people don't even make money through their music. They just do it because they love it and they want to communicate with other people and they want to express themselves. I just see no reason to then tell someone what you did there is not good. Like it doesn't make sense to me.
Sure, sure. That's I agree with you on that. But I think that it's really important for us to speak a little bit about your history writing because you were Spotify's global music team head. And
Not exactly. That would make me a bit bigger than I actually was.
oh,
I was the team lead of the global music editorial team.
okay,
So
that's something different then.
yeah, it's a part of the music team. So there's the music team and then there's the music editorial, which
Right.
is basically everything that has to do with playlists and programming on the service. So the person that you just the job title that you just gave me, that was my boss.
Oh, well, I think I sent you up a rung, right?
No, it's fine, but I mean, music editorial is, I think, one of the important parts in the streaming ecosystem, but it's not like I grew up on writing for magazines, doing radio, and then later writing online magazines and blogs and all that kind of stuff. And then editorial at a streaming service is more like radio programming. So you select playlists, you curate playlists. That's the official term that you use. And in my case, I was leading the global editorial team. So we were making all the policies for the local editors in the markets to, yeah, to be able to curate their offerings.
Oh, okay. Well, still, it's quite a different role to be playing with Spotify for such a long period of time and then transition to your newsletter on the fringe.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. I mean, I was at Spotify for 6 years, and then left the company in 2022. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do at that point, so I took kind of like a mini sabbatical for a summer. At that point, I had also, me and my wife, we had bought an old farmhouse here in the countryside and we started working on renovating it. So that was like my summer sabbatical project. And then when I got back into working mode again, I was mostly thinking about like music editorial, how I got to know it was a lot about storytelling, you know? And that is something that in the playlist and curation world, I was missing a little bit, to be honest with you. Like that had other interesting aspects to it, but that storytelling part, I was really missing that. So I went back to writing, consulting, and being a freelance journalist, basically. And because you can't really, like in this current media landscape, it's really hard to make a living off of just writing for newspapers and magazines like I did back in the day. There's some more corporate um, things that I do, but those also have to do with music editorial. I work for Universal Music's Global Classic and Jazz division as an editorial consultant. And I also work for the German classical label Deutsche Grammophon, do editorial stuff for them and consult them on editorial matters. And then the newsletter, I basically started that as a side project, a side hustle, if you want. In the first moment, it was more about, I'm the person for most of my friends to turn towards when they need new music and recommendations. And it's always been that way. Like back in the days, I made mixtapes for them, then I made playlists. And then at that point, I thought it would be cool to just write this newsletter, send it out to all my friends and like industry people, acquaintances. So started with just a handful of people, and then it grew organically into what it's today, which is, yeah, a newsletter, a weekly newsletter on experimental music and culture with over 2,000 subscribers. And yeah, I really love doing it. And it's become a part of my job, though I have to say that I couldn't really make a living just off of the newsletter alone.
Sure, sure. That when you're in the creative realm, it's very difficult to make a living out of one thing. You have to spread yourself thin across a couple of different projects to be able to support yourself. I know that experience myself very clearly.
I can imagine, of course. I mean, I had different phases in my life. I've been in the music industry for 25 years now, and I had phases where I had, full-time employee type jobs at magazines or publishing houses, and then Spotify. And then in other phases, it was more freelancing project-based work. And I think right now I'm in such a phase, which also allows me to, yeah, just do different stuff and live out here in the countryside, which makes, yeah, I work remotely, and I really enjoy being out here. I've lived in Berlin for 15 years, I think. And but I'm originally from northern Germany, small village. So it was really, yeah, again, felt like coming home a bit to move out here.
That's so sweet, and seems to be a very common a thing for people to be doing, especially in this post-pandemic era.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I didn't plan on it, but 3 years ago, I did a major move from an urban city outside of Providence, Rhode Island, where I lived for 15 years with my husband. And unfortunately, he went to the next realm. So I just thought, well, what am I going to do next? And I always wanted to live in the area where I live now, which is in the Hudson Valley. And I just thought, okay, well, this is your chance. You should just pick up and move. You don't have anything holding you down. And I
Yeah,
ended up living in a very, very rural area, which that wasn't on my scope of things or places, things to do or places to be. But all of a sudden, I'm finding myself owning a pickaxe and a shovel and hammer and trying to figure out how to deal with my own problems, not only fixing the house, but, taking care of the land. And it's
yeah,
just, it's a big, big, big shift from the kind of urban lifestyle like what yours might have been like in Berlin, to just bootstrapping my way.
yeah, absolutely. No, I think we're on a similar way there. Like again, we've been working on the house out here. Like we live semi off grid, I would say. So we power most of our stuff with solar energy. We don't have running warm water, like all that. It's a bit of a
Yeah.
different, like you said, it's different than having like your nice apartment in the city and going to your cubicle job every day and taking the train, and like all of that stuff doesn't really work out here. Like it's very different. And
Popping into
um
the coffee shop or the local pub.
we don't have that. Like that village where
I
I'm in right
know.
now, it's just a couple of houses on a cobblestone road, and it's we don't even have a supermarket or anything. You would have to go to the next town, which is like 15 miles from here. So
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Yeah.
but we're pretty much, yeah. But we've decided that for this period in our life. This is what we want, what we're looking for. And like you said, I think after the pandemic or even during the pandemic, many people in my like among my friends and other people I know have decided similar things for them, that urban lifestyle with, living in a box, basically, getting into the box, driving into the big box where you have your little box, and then watching movies on the small box at night. That isn't,
Right.
it's fine, but it's not how many people imagine to live their life. Maybe you had other dreams, and I really don't want to romanticize this too much because, like you said, and it's hard work. It's a lot of, there's a lot of challenges coming with this rural lifestyle as well. So it's not like you move out here and all your problems are gone or anything. But yeah, it's just a different lifestyle, different way of life, and I really enjoy it right now.
And, I was just thinking as you were talking about boxes that it doesn't allow us to listen if you're living in all these boxes. And it doesn't open up our ears to, I think the box enables us to close our ears off to the world around us because it creates an environment that's specific. It chokes out painful sounds or irritating sounds or your annoying neighbor or whatever that is occurring in the world. And so each of those environments that you were talking about, whether it's the train or the home or actually the box of the television or your program that you're watching, everything is sort of designed for you in a sense,
Yeah,
designed for your listening, designed for your listening pleasure, as one of the statements I recalls.
yeah, personalized. Yeah,
Yeah, and then we personalize what we hear with our iPods or our MP3 players. I guess that's kind of old school now, but everybody has their own personal playlist on their iPods, so that also is designed for our personal hearing and listening, and it doesn't inspire investigation
yeah,
into other things we could listen to, whether it's music or outside of the music, for example, experimental music. And
right.
this brings me to a topic that you had mentioned earlier, that where you're talking about your love for experimental music and that how for you it's an adventure. And I thought, maybe hearing from you about what that adventure is like would be really interesting.
Yeah. When I listen to music, and I tend to try to not to use music these days as just something that numbs me or that shuts me off, like all those people with noise canceling headphones. And I have those as well on the train in the big city. And I was one of these people, and I don't judge it, but it's not the same as mindfully listening to a piece of music and directing your full attention to it. Um, and I saw that I was missing that part. I was just listening to music all day, but it was more in the background, and then it was on my headphones, so I didn't have to listen to like noises around me, or it shut me off from the outside world. People are listening to podcasts, and all of that is fine. Again, don't get me wrong, but mindfully listening to a piece of experimental music, for example, is something, it's a different experience. And what I find interesting about it is the unpredictability of it. And that's even something that during my studies, I saw that the composer John Cage, who was, of course, very instrumental in the development of experimental music of the 20th century, he said that the unpredictability is the main factor that makes music experimental. That is for him, that is the main genre descriptor, if you will. So I noticed that for me, I've always just loved unpredictable music. And again, if you listen to mainstream top 40 radio, there's nothing unpredictable with it. Like it's just, it's nice songs. There's nothing wrong with it. But those are just like they have all the same structure, they have all the same length, even though they tend to get shorter and shorter. But they have like a verse, chorus structure. And if you listen to a couple of seconds of a contemporary pop song, you know what will happen. And that is, to many people who love that type of music, that is exactly the appeal.
Sure.
Whereas I love being surprised by music and art. I love being, there's the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa who always talks about resonance. So I want to feel that resonance, I want to feel spoken to by a piece. And that I feel happens with art and music, which is not designed in a way that it is based on repetition or, specific things, cues happening to manipulate me into feeling something. Because that's another thing, like unpredictability is one and manipulating is the other thing. I don't want to feel like the music is trying to manipulate me. And that is what, for example, a lot of film scores actually do.
Oh, sure.
And it's again, it's an art form and it's fine. But if you take someone like Hans Zimmer, who is probably the most successful film score composer of all time, some of his earlier work was very predictable, very manipulative in a way that you see a scene on the film and the music tells you what to feel about it.
Yep.
What I love is if the music doesn't try to tell me how to feel, but if it asks questions instead, or if it just gives me cues to find out and just look into my emotions myself and find what do I feel? Yeah, maybe a long-winded answer to your question, but I think that.
Yeah, yeah. It's so fascinating. But if we go from the general arena of listening to music and then bearing down to the sounds, I know you had mentioned to me in passing that you love to know how new sounds are made.
Yeah, that's also something that I think for me it's part of that experience that I was just talking about. When I hear something or if I listen to a piece and I don't know how these sounds are made that I'm hearing, then that is like the first aspect that really gets me going. I want to find out what am I hearing here? If I hear an instrument and it's very clear, oh yeah, this is an acoustic guitar, these are drums, this is an electric bass. Again, that can be fine. And most of the time it is, but I love it when I don't know what I'm hearing. Or if an instrument, for example, is used in a way that it's not normally used. So it sounds very different. And you find out, oh, this drone was made from a cello. Wow, this is amazing. I wouldn't have thought that you could make these kind of sounds with a cello. So yeah, I think again that plays into that notion of just surprise. And art for me is always like it's something where I wanna be surprised, where I don't want it to feel stale. I don't want it to feel like I've already heard it or saw it. And pop music plays into that. A good pop song, some A&R managers were telling me that a good pop song needs to sound like, you need to feel like you've heard it before. That wouldn't happen when you listen to a Pauline piece, really. Like when I first heard Bye Bye Butterfly, I was like, what is this? What's going on here? Like, what this feels chaotic. This feels like it doesn't have a structure, even though it does, but you can't really pinpoint it at first. And it doesn't have that verse, chorus structure. It goes back to late 80s, early 90s, me listening to music, and I think I quickly understood how popular music is made and how it works. But then finding, for example, electronic music, more experimental electronic music, which wasn't sounding like that, was completely different. So that drew me in. Hip hop drew me in originally because it was different. That's why, for example, today's hip hop, most of it doesn't really interest me too much because it's become mainstream. It kind of follows the formulas of popular music these days. Back when I discovered it, to me, it was experimental music because it was so different. It was these people predominantly in New York, doing rapping over first disco beats and then later these very abrasive drum machine sounds that didn't exist before. So when I heard that, that really changed my whole perception of what music can be and how it can sound. How this, for example, can show me through it's like a sound painting to me. And when I saw these images of how New York looked in the 80s, for example, that was transported to me through the music. It was just, I was hearing the music and I was seeing these images before I even actually saw them in a movie or somewhere else.
Yeah, that era is so rich when you talk about it from the very beginning and the founding of hip hop and how it evolved from a bunch of guys really competing over sounds and
Yeah,
trying to outdo the other. It was a competition in a sense. Um,
exactly. Then again, and that all, I mean, I don't want to, this is probably a bit off topic now, but even that aspect with the sound system culture, that all came from a small island in the Caribbean. So how interesting is that? That like the musical culture of a small island in the Caribbean can influence the whole world, and it can still have an impact on like global popular culture. That's amazing to me.
and that goes back to your original premise as being on the fringe. If you look further back in time, you'll find the beginning ideas and the seeds of what eventually evolved.
Yeah,
But
you're right.
and and I know that when you think about that, it goes back to a topic that you uh, earlier illuminated a little bit about, which was about naming, how naming the sounds is something that you struggle with too, because
Hmm.
how it sort of folds into your Buddhist approach to living. And before putting more words into your mouth,
Yeah, yeah, I know. I mean, I've basically made a profession about around finding words for music, right? And even when I started writing about music, doing music journalism, some people were saying like, "Why are you doing this? This is like dancing architecture, you know? It's like it doesn't make sense.
oh,
Like,
nice.
why would you write about music? You can just do music, feel music." But I always thought, no, I think it gives it another aspect, another dimension, and it's important to look at music through that more intellectual lens of language. Then I discovered Zen Buddhism, like John Cage actually did at one point, and it made him into a different composer because he started using chance operations and all that type of stuff. But for me as a music writer, I went into a deep crisis because Zen is basically saying, don't put the words, like don't put the labels on the things, on the actual experiences, because the word is not the experience. The word ocean is not the feeling of diving into this amazing mass of water. It's just a different thing, and putting words and labels onto these things and experiences can lead to us can lead to some sort of barrier between us and living our life, actually. So I had a deep crisis in my job, and I for a while I couldn't really write a word about music anymore because I felt it didn't make sense anymore to me. You needed to experience it. You needed to go out there and experience the music, make the music, play the music, or just even listen to the music, but not put those words on them. And then I got back into a habit of writing about music after I published my first book, which had nothing to do with music. It was about mindfulness and minimalism and living that lifestyle that we've been touching upon a little bit. But after that, I just very naturally, when I started writing just for, training my writing muscle, basically, I felt the topic that I felt drawn towards was music and art. That was what I always wrote about. But what had changed was I didn't take my own opinions and labels that seriously anymore. And I don't expect anyone to do it. So it's not that important. It's great. I love doing it, but it's also a bit of a game, it's a language game that we're playing. And it makes sense because it's a way how we can communicate about culture and music. But yeah, I don't think my own opinions on a certain piece of music are that important anymore. It's just I want to point people towards stuff I find interesting, and I want to tell stories. I want to tell stories about artists and the way that they create and the path that they have behind them.
There's so much to think about in what you just said. One of the things that caught my attention was the word is not the experience. And that brings me back to the topic of listening. And listening is about an experience, having an experience. And it's also an adventure, which is another topic that you spoke about even earlier in our conversation, because it's a time-based experience. When you begin tuning your ears to your environment, that's one moment. But as time evolves, then over that period of time, you have an experience which is an adventure.
I would absolutely agree with that. And for me, the ultimate adventure in that sense is actually improvised music, because then it gets more unpredictable, because it's not just the listeners who are attentive. The people that make the music, they make, like, in every single moment, they make a decision what they want to create, what they want to put out there, and the sounds that they wanna create, and what is the right sound now. What sounds do I like? Do I want to hear in this very moment? So I go a lot to, like, what we call micro venues, like small concerts, 20, 30, 40 people in a room, musicians improvising with one another, no big stage. And what I feel in the best moments can happen there is that the musicians and the audience, they kind of become one,
Yeah.
because through that mindful practice of improvising music and then listening, a connection forms in the room, and that's a different connection from that type of consumer mentality that I described earlier. And this is something that I'm very much after right now. So I'm always seeking for these type of situations where an exchange can happen between the artists and the audiences, which is on an eye level.
Well, that's the having the improvised music and making that connection with mindfulness as a practice is really a beautiful association to make, because I can see how clearly how they're all based on living in the moment, responding to an environment, responding to a musical trigger, responding to what you've heard, and then continuing that, but also letting go of what preceded it. So it's this constant process of acting and reacting.
And not making plans. Maybe you made plans, but then in that specific moment, it all can change. It can all be very different.
And
that's
judgment.
Yeah, exactly. Lift off judgment. I think that was one of my main takeaways from that deep listening course, that lift off judgment thing. And that goes back again to what I said earlier about my crisis in journalism. I was, how can I lift off judgment when judgment is what my whole profession is based on, you know? That was where the type of questions that I was asking myself at that
dear.
point. But again, I don't take it that seriously anymore. And if I go out now and I get into these kind of situations, I often, the first question for me is not, do I like this? Many people, they go somewhere, they go to a concert or they watch an artist listen to a song and they're like, oh, do I like this? I don't know if I like this. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I don't really care too much for in the first place. Much more important is, do I find it interesting? Does it interest me what happens here? Do I want to follow it? Do I want to direct my attention to it? And in many cases, it's not the stuff that I immediately like that will have like a big impact on me for a longer time. In fact, I just published a list of 100 albums that rocked my world. That's how I phrased it. So a lot of these albums, when I first heard them, I didn't like them. But there was something that made me go back and want to find out more, want to listen to them again. And that's much more valuable than immediately going and liking liking something, because that's like consumption. It's very quick, and maybe tomorrow you don't really care anymore.
Stephan, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, but I want to thank you so much for this fascinating interview. And I can tell that it could go on forever, but we'll have to stop for the moment. Thank you again. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Listening with China Blue. I hope it inspires you to build your own listening practice. This begins as a daily practice of attentively listening without judgment. And you can ask yourself, what is your own version of silence? The music for this podcast is from China Blue's Saturn Walk, co-composed with Lance Massey, the creator of the T-Mobile ringtone. If you want to learn more about me and my work, go to ChinaBlueArt.com. And also, please follow me on Facebook at china.blue.art, at Instagram at china_blue_art, and on X at China Blue Art.